Hi, everybody. Welcome back, or if you're new, welcome for the first time to the Recovery Boot Camp and Schnellenberger Family Foundation, second installment of Basic Training Family Edition. Those of you that don't remember or don't care, my name is Rabbi Mark Rotenberg, and I am the minister to the community here, as well as group facilitator and case manager. Last week, we started off in our first ever edition, and we are continuing today. Hopefully it'll be a long-running, repetitive program that you can all enjoy and utilize. Before we go any further, I'd like to introduce my amazing executive producer, who's my friend and colleague, Dave Zafe, who's going to make a few announcements vis-a-vis technical things. Dave?
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Just a couple technical issues I just wanted to go over with you guys. First and foremost, if you missed last week and this is your first time here, welcome. If you did want to catch up and watch last week's webinar, you can. It's very simple. All you guys have to do is go on to recoverybootcamp.com, scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page. There you'll see a link where it says Basic Training Family Edition. All you have to do is click on that, and you'll see our first week's session. And as we progress each week, we'll have all the previous week sessions on there as well. So in the end of this first cycle, all 10 presentations will be available. Also, as far as viewing the webinar, there's two ways to do it. You can either log into our webinar and view it online on a web page, or you can actually download the GoToWebinar program or app if you're using a mobile phone. And that one's actually a little bit easier to use because you're able to control how big the presentation is, as well as Mark's video feed. So you can make it bigger or smaller, and it's a little bit easier to access the handouts. And speaking of handouts, we still have all the handouts from last week available. So we have the 3 assessments that we gave you guys for homework. So hopefully you did those. If it's your first time joining us, we ask that you download those handouts and fill them out to the best of your ability and keep them, and just keep them handy, because later on in the presentation, a few weeks from now, maybe towards the end, we're going to go over those results and see how you scored. Also, we've added a new handout, and this is our workbook. So it's every single slide that Rabbi Mark's going to be talking about over the course of the entire 10-week curriculum. And we want you guys to be able to print that out. There's notes, lines for notes next to each slide. So if you have a lot of paper in your printer, go ahead and print out that sucker, and then you'll be able to follow along and actually take notes as Mark is talking about the slides. Other than that, I know technical issues can arise, so if you guys have any questions, please just go to the question box on your webinar and type in your question. I'll be in the background on the sidelines answering questions for you guys throughout Mark's presentation. So I think that's all I got, Mark. Good to go. I'm going to pass it back over to Mark. Guys, enjoy.
All right, everyone. Oops, jumped ahead. Well, I guess we know why everybody's here, or you might. So, as you may know, we're located in South Florida, and yesterday there was a horrific tragedy that occurred in a high school about 30 minutes from here. And if you would if I could have your indulgence, if you would just indulge me for a minute, I was hoping that maybe we could do a short moment of silence, maybe some introspection or prayer if you'd like, for the people that died, and even the ones that didn't, that are wounded both physically and emotionally. You join me. Thank you. Thanks for indulging me. So I actually want to talk a little bit about that, not in terms of any comparative reality or even anything political at all, but really to bring focus back to the idea of addiction and stigma. So this morning I did a little bit of research, and the GVA, which is the Gun Violence Archive, which is it's an NGO, and they've been tracking gun violence for probably the last 10 or 12 years consistently, and their statistics are very accurate. Put out the statistics for last year, specifically 2017, vis-a-vis gun deaths in this country. And when I say gun deaths, I mean every single incident that resulted in death, whether it was an accidental shooting, officer involved, either the perpetrator or the officer died, accidental shootings, home invasion, defense shootings, mass shootings, the entire gambit in the United States. And what we found in last year's numbers is that approximately 15,590 people were killed from gun-related incidents in this country. Not to compare, but solely as a point of reference. In the same year, from May 2016 to May 2017, 66,324 overdoses from drugs in the same exact period. And I'm not bringing this to bring a correlation between the two, but what I'm trying to show you is that when we have a tragedy like the high school shooting, it becomes the topic of conversation in the forefront of the consciousness. And how long it lasts it's irrespective to the fact that it does become a public conversation on multiple levels. What we don't see, however, is the conversation nationally about the death due to substance abuse in this country. And I think that it really brings us to this idea of stigma that we talked about last week. And we have to understand that it's not that one is worse than the other. The numbers reflect a 4-time increase in gun death violence for drug overdoses in this country. But what we have to understand is it's still the majority of the American population, a lot of them, I don't know if it's completely the majority, but the consciousness, the social consciousness of this country still perceives the addiction and the addict as a result of their own choices, that their addiction is their fault. So the resulting things that occur from that particular addiction are indeed their fault too. They are indeed culpable in their own violence. And I would have to say that is not real. And I would tell you this, it is not the addict's fault that they are an addict. And as we progress, we will see that because of the myriad of factors and variables that come into the development of this disease, which is neurological, as we stated last week. It is, however, absolutely their responsibility to get better once they step out of the ignorance and denial of the disease and into the understanding that they have one. So what I'd like to ask you just off the bat is a quick poll question. And that poll question is for you as family members. How many of you think, at least in part, that you are in fact responsible on some level for the addiction of your family member? I'll give you a few seconds to answer, and then we'll look at the results.
Mark, while they're answering, Trina asked a question. She wants to know if those statistics you gave were for just drug overdoses or drug-related deaths.
They are specifically, the 66,000 are drug overdoses, and that is from the National Center for Health Statistics, which is a government organization that puts out these. So it is specifically drug death from overdoses, not the overdoses that didn't result in death or accidents or things related to usage, right? So they are specifically for drug overdoses. And by the way, that increase is a 17% from the previous year that was about 56,500. Now, oddly enough, what we know this year, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has actually lowered the life expectancy for the average American because of the vast number of overdose deaths in this country, and because they tend to appear in a certain age range, which drops the national average of life expectancy. So the uprise in overdose deaths has actually caused a decrease in expectancy of life for Americans. Okay, I see your poll results, and I see that the majority of you, by a slim margin, 53% actually believe that you are in fact in some way or another responsible for the addiction of your family member. I am here to tell you unequivocally and absolutely that this is not even close to being a fact. You are not in fact responsible. Again, in the same way that the addict is not responsible for their own disease, neither are you. And when we talk about Al-Anon, we'll talk about the 3 C's, which is coming in a few sessions. And those are, I did not cause it, I cannot control it. And there's one more, which we'll save for later, because that's a big one. So let's move into the things that we're doing. Oh, there's one thing before we get into the slides that I wanted to do. We had a lot of questions last week. I tried to answer as many as I could on emails, and we found that a lot of the questions were about drug-specific neurology and neuropharmacology for specific drugs. This is great, and I'm glad that there's a lot of interest, but this is a topic that we will not, in fact, be covering in this. For information of that, I would recommend SAMHSA, SAMHSA, or the NIH, which is National Institute on Health, nih.gov or samhsa.com or org. I'll find it out for sure. There was one question that I pulled that I'd like to talk about and answer for you guys orally. And this was from Rebecca. And Rebecca asks, as a parent of a child, should you continue to facilitate return to treatment ad nauseum despite the identified patient's inability to sustain and follow the prescribed continuum of recovery? And this is really what we're getting to the heart of it. And we're going to arc into this idea of enabling and help. And that's what all this initial information about disease models and recovery is all about. How do we understand to separate between enabling and help when those lines cross and when we step over them, either knowingly or unknowingly? It's an amazing question. And the truth is that it's inherently a case-by-case approach. There are certain factors where you have to draw your own boundaries specifically, right? And we'll talk about those at length. But because it's case by case, I urge everyone to be in contact with either a drug or alcohol counselor or some sort of treatment professional in concert with their identified patient. Now, what we find also, because it's somewhat, the science about the disease is solid, but the treatment is sometimes considered unscientific because a good part of it is predicated on the commitment and willingness of the patient to do the work, right? Which means, what are they ready to invest? How long are they ready to stay with the continuum of recovery? And really, does it go to a place of compliance, or does that compliance transfer into amenability? Do I do it to get out from under? And while I'm doing it, am I actually doing it enough so that internally I can have a switch? And that switch goes from external commitment, which is situational, to internal commitment, which is internal. And hopefully we'll get to those slides today when talking about that type of paradigm. And it was an excellent question, Rebecca. Thank you very much for your participation. So last week we left off on slide 16. So, oops, got to click. Got it. I'm getting the hang of it. So let's get to that slide, okay? We covered a lot of information. We were talking about the disease model and Western training, increases in awareness from the medical community. We talked about the pill conundrum. We talked about ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, its development and its acceptance of this 3-way modeling for disease. We talked about the biopsychosocial model, which was the first model, which we addressed as being very excellent for diagnostics, but really not that great for treatment where it initially started, approached as a treatment. That's why prior to the development of cognitive therapies, people were inherently locked away for chronic use because they were in fact removed from their sociological influences because you couldn't really address the biological unless you killed them, which would solve the problem, or psychologically gave them some sort of frontal lobotomy, which would probably also cure the problem. Just a little intense, those treatment modalities. And that brings us to slide 16. We're still on the biopsychosocial model. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about the biological component. It covers genetic predisposition, which in its own stage has a thing called allele groupings, There's about certain identifying marker percentages and population percentages. And we're going to talk about those specifically in depth. We're also going to talk about ethanol alcohol, E2OH, and its processing, normal versus alcoholic. Now, let me state before we get slammed with a bunch of questions that the way that alcohol is processed through the metabolic system is identical to the way that opioids are processed. Stimulants are processed slightly different, and so are dissociative and hallucinogens. However, let me state this about the entire thing of the different drug pathologies. Every single one of those drugs, as vastly different as their responses or their flavor, if you will, they also operate in different neuroreceptors in the brain. But all the receptors are part of the system of the brain, which is the mesolimbic system. So there are multiple systems in the brain. The mesolimbic specifically is the system that deals between stress and reward. And that contains the entire cadre of neuroreceptors. So any drug that has an addictive pathology or a feeling that one can receive pleasure from or a reward actually operates deeply within that mesolimbic system. We're going to talk about neurofurrowing, which we mentioned earlier last week in depth. So what we can see here in slide 17 is a little kind of picture of how ethanol alcohol is reduced to acetaldehyde, which then goes to acetate. In essence, what happens is when you consume the alcohol or the heroin, mostly with the depressants, it works this way, specifically heroin, that the body processes it through the metabolic system. It steps down twice in different types of alcohols, the H3C, the CHO, and then what occurs is it goes to the acetone state. The acetone state in the normal drinker, or someone that is taking pain medication, for instance, in a small dosage regularly as prescribed, then processes those sugars, excuse me, those acetones into sugars and complex carbohydrates, which are then broken down. So it's interesting because what we find is that in early recovery for heroin users as well as alcohol users is that a lot of the Jones or desire to drink or use is really a insulin, somewhat of an insulin imbalance. It's really the desire. It's like a weird junky sweet tooth. They really desire the alcohol, the sugar that comes from the process of the alcohol. And oddly enough, that's why there's a huge relationship between alcoholism specifically, as well as heroin usage and diabetes, adult onset diabetes. Because what you have to understand is that one shot of pure grain alcohol, not even pure grain tequila, whiskey, whatever it is about 320 calories, and it's all processed into sugar. The problem with the alcoholic process is that it stops at acetate, right? This is really the cause of what is called the phenomenon of craving. It operates this way. The brain understands that it's plugged up. It gets plugged up. It's not sophisticated enough to say, well, maybe if you stop drinking, it will slowly process through. It kind of works on the plunger idea. There's a clog, and I'm just going to shove more in there until it breaks through the system and forces my metabolism to process that, which is why someone who's a heavy drinker, and alcoholic specifically, really wants the first drink, but they really, 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 really want the fifth drink, because that acetone causes that craving, because the brain believes that if you just overload the system, it will inherently flush it through. So the psychological component, actually, let's back up a little bit. Let's go back 2 slides to 16, and let me talk a little bit about genetic predisposition. So the way it works is there's not a single gene for addiction. What we know now is that it's based on alleles, and alleles are these kind of binary on-off switches that sit on the ribosomal nucleic acid on the chain. And they're markers not for like, ooh, I like heroin, or ooh, I like alcohol. They're markers for neurochemicals. Continuously, what we find is that most alcoholics have at least There's seven. There's actually seven that make up the addiction group, but there's one that's a constant. It tends to be the oxytocin marker, which shows that we tend to have a higher level of oxytocin production than most normal people, which inherently means that in our own perception of our own life and the lives around us, we believe that we feel things stronger than others. And it may manifest as emotional lability or hypercatastrophization or worry or anxiety, but we tend to feel things intensely. And when you ask any alcoholic or anyone in recovery from childhood, did they remember feeling that they felt emotions stronger than the people around them? Almost consistently, 100% across the board, the answer is yes. So of these seven markers, if there are at least four that are in an open position, open v closed, then the probability that these people have to become active addicts or alcoholics in adulthood is around 80%. So there's some interesting numbers. So what we know from the Human Genome Project, which has been collecting genetic samples for years and has really been very in the front of understanding this, that about 15% of the world's population qualifies with at least 4 or 7 of these genetic markers to put them into what is called a predisposed category. So 15% of the world's population has a higher probability or potentiality to become an active addict or alcoholic. Yet what we know is that really only about 10% of the world's population are active addicts and alcoholics, which means that there's multiple factors involved, right? Environment, process, all of these things. And most people think, well, that's simple. They have the genetic predisposition, they just never picked up a drink or never smoked a joint or never did a line of Coke at a party. Well, that's not necessarily true. The reason these people do not become alcoholics is still a mystery. And when we understand that difference, I think that we will have another step forward in treatment modality, understanding that difference. But suffice it to say that it actually changes the statistic. Because if you look and say that people that have this marker or this grouping have an 80% probability of becoming alcoholics, yet only 2/3 of all the people that have it, it brings it down to 66%. So there's a bizarre anomaly in the genetic understanding. Okay. Neurofurrowing, neuroprocessors. So let's move on to that slide. So we have this mesolimbic response, right? And that means that it's stress to reward, stress to reward, stress to reward. And as that becomes used, right, it's like, the example is this. Have you ever seen a corner lot in a city that's vacant and people walk diagonally across it instead of going all the way around the corner? They walk on it so much that the city comes and they put up the yellow tape and they try to plant the seed and all this, and it never works. There's always that groove. It's like if you're walking in the woods and you see a deer trail. There could have been no deers on that thing for 20 years and there's still a deer trail because it's inherently furrowed. So the more often that you have this stress response mechanism, the deeper that groove gets cut. And neurochemicals tend to act like water. They seek their own level. Fastest distance between straightest 2 points, right? Straight line, quick response, quick. So really when people have drugs of preference, they don't in fact prefer the drug. It's an odd thing. What happens is their brain finds that it responds to that particular stimulant or chemical or depressant in a way that's pleasurable vis-a-vis the response. So it talks to the other part of the brain and says, hey buddy, we need to convince our host that this is the drug he likes because we like the response. And it happens in a subconscious reality. So cognitive response is me being aware of that afterwards. And so that's what we try to change. Because the brain is adipose tissue, it is a fat cell inherently, which means that the tissue itself does not regenerate. It doesn't really become necrotic through the process, doesn't die, just becomes grooved and channeled. We cannot in fact fill those things in. What we have to do is develop new ones. And there's multiple techniques that we're going to talk about at length when we get into the recovery model that really facilitate and expedite that particular process through a thing that's called polypeptide chaining, which is the development of huge lengths of amino acids to create those things. So let's talk a little bit about exposure vis-a-vis the psychological component. So was I exposed to drugs in high school? Were my friends experimenting? Did I live in a culture that was condoning of it or condemning of it? Was I involved in a subculture? So there's a lot of external or environmental processes that come into the development psychologically of how someone approaches drugs. What are their boundaries? What are their lines? How do they perceive the legal ramifications? Does it bother them? Do they see them as minimal or maximal, right? And that's, again, where the preferences come in. Like, we tend to go to those things. So not only can our brain tell us what drug we like, but we can in turn tell our brain what drug we like, which then in turn tells us that that's the one we like again. And there's the final one, which is inculcation. And inculcation is a process of repeated teaching over and over and over again. And so in essence, we teach our brain at the same time furrowing it, while we are taught from outside sources the exact same issue. Dude, you got to do this to be cool. Hang out, you can't come to the party. A whole myriad of things. Let's move on to the next slide. So now we're talking about the sociological component, which blends because there's environmental influence in the psychological as well as the physical. And there's also sociological in the environmental, sociological in the physical. When we're looking at a triangular model, these things are not indifferent from each other. They actually feed into each other in both directions repeatedly. So it becomes a cycle. So in the sociological component, we're talking about environmental things, not so much peer groups, but trauma specifically. And trauma is interesting. The biggest trauma that almost every alcoholic and addict suffers from is the trauma of abandonment and rejection. These two particular psychological traumas are what nearly every addict suffers from. Now, I will say this. None of you abandoned or rejected your family members. Trauma is an interesting dilemma because it's a perceived dilemma. And what the addict perceives as their trauma is their trauma, whether those things are real or imagined. Plus, because of hypercatastrophization, small individual traumas that occur in the continuum of life, a lot of times in the developmental stages of psychology, between the ages of 6 and 12, which is labeled the absolute absorber, where we are conscious and cogent enough to process pain, hurt, and feelings without the sophistication to take ourselves out of the immediate emotional reality and process it in a healthy way or in an adult way. We tend to form patterns, reactionary patterns, where in essence, as adults, we still have these small perceived traumas that create templates of reactions and behaviors that we still utilize as adults. It's like this. Let's say you know a brilliant child who is a mathematical genius who's 8 years old. Can sit at the board, solve all kinds of equations, do everything, like ready to go to Harvard, right? At age 10. Would you ask this child to do your taxes? His mathematical skills are amazing. Yet I'm fairly sure he doesn't know anything about the tax law. And in essence, as addicts, that's what we have. We have children making adult decisions in our brain, right? Then we can talk about, in terms of the sociological component, the peer or social groups. And we touched on that. Peer pressure, you got to do this, you got to do that. And unfortunately, the society that we live in does struggle with a little bit of an issue. And that issue is the issue that has plagued every alcoholic I've ever met. And again, when I say alcoholic, I mean all drug addicts. It's just my default verbiage because a lot of the things I'm bringing are, the exemplars are from the book Alcoholics Anonymous. So, but again, does not matter what drug it is. The result is the same. The treatment is the same in terms of cognitive work. So Image versus essence. The idea has always been, if I looked a certain way, if I had certain stuff, if I was accepted, excuse me, excuse me for a second. If I was accepted, if I was better looking, if my image was stellar and my appearance externally was awesome, I would in turn feel awesome inside. Then my essence would follow suit and blossom. Incorrect. And it's one of the banes of the alcoholic mind. And part of it is social, and a lot of it is cultural, right? We live in an acquisitional society. We live in a world where the guy with the most toys wins, right? But the truth is that when I strive to get outside things, to fix my inside dilemmas and my traumas that are real to me, I may acquire those things, but I tend to lose them because when those things do not bring happiness, I tend to self-sabotage and go back to maladaptive behaviors. And so it's really about image versus essence. What we know on a spiritual level, which is somewhat of a spiritual axiom, is there's nothing wrong with having things. The Buddhists talk about the attachment. It's not the thing, it's the attachment. It's the power I put in that thing to make me feel a certain way. What we know as a spiritual axiom is that when I make my desire to be fulfilled and happy, when I make that my goal and I strive to attain that, what tends to happen is the external things that are image-based tend to come to me as the byproduct of that work. Again, spiritual axiom, hard to find proof text except in, I don't know, every religious book ever written, but again, suppositional. And the very last one that we have is this idea of conducivity. How conducive is my immediate, next larger, and even larger environment to the pathology of using drugs and having drugs? I don't know, turn on the television and watch a Budweiser commercial. What can I say? There is huge pressure that society becomes conducive to these ideas, again, predicated on the image reality. Question. We have a question. What differentiates the community disease model from the medical disease model? Select one of the following. The medical model does not contain an environmental factor. The community model incorporates the full medical model. Dun, 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 dun.
They could be identical in nature too. I don't know why you don't see that.
Oh, or they could be identical in nature. I don't see it. I only get two. Or it could be none of them. They only give me half the answers. They assume that I should know this. Maybe. Oh, see, you know why? Because it says it's in progress for attendees only, not for me. Okay, let me throw all my stuff away. Oh, and you probably can't see me anyway when this thing's up. Oh, that's awesome. But you can hear me, so I can be doubly annoying. Like, will you just tell him to shut up while I'm trying to answer the question? Please don't type that to Dave, please. It'll hurt me more than it hurts him, but you know, I'm an alcoholic and my ego is fragile as well, just so you know. Well, while you're doing that, oh, too late. I'm back. Now you can see me and I can annoy you visually and verbally. So we got the answers? We got the answers. Awesome. What differentiates the community disease model from the medical model? The medical model does not contain an environmental factor. That's what most of you said. Well, is not the sociological factor environmental in nature? Maybe. The community model incorporates the full medical model, and they are identical or none of the above. The answer is, Dave doesn't know. B or 2 or whatever it is. The community model does in fact incorporate the entire medical model within it. What it does is it actually condenses it into 2 factorials instead of 3. And we will talk about that. Oops, got to click on the other one. Now, so these are the models. This is the community disease model. Let me give you a little background about it. So it was a secondary developmental model, and it really started to come into the forefront in, I think, the late 50s and early 60s. Kind of the advent of immunology also was with this. This model is still used today effectively by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, to vector outbreaks, diseases, I don't know, zombie apocalypses, things of that nature, because it takes into consideration the one thing that the medical model left out. And what that breaks down to is the host, which is the person, genetic predisposition, biological and psychological. It takes those 2 components from the medical model and compresses them into the person themselves, which is a departure from the old idea and the old way of looking at mental illness or neurological disease. Up until even recent times, physical ailments were considered vastly different than medical ailments, but we now know, because of the systemic reality of the human body, that these things are deeply intertwined. So it understands that and brings the host as a full package, psychological and physiological, into one category. Then it brings in the environment, and the environment is really what the sociological component of the medical model was. But then what it adds is the AOH, the agent of harm. Agent of harm is what makes this model a little bit more developed, or the next stage of the medical model. Because the agent of harm is the drug, the drink, or even the process addiction that you engage in. Do I drink? Do I smoke weed? Do I gamble? Do I watch porn? Do I have sex? All those things, like too much. Process addictions and substance addictions have the exact same neurological reality, only one is stimulated by an external chemical and the other one is stimulated by a behavior which causes increases in downloading of certain chemicals in that mesolimbic system that makes that stress to reward reality. Stress to reward. I sit at a card table. I'm like, oh man, am I going to pull the jack on the river? What's going on? I got this really kind of a thing. And then I get it, boom, and I have the reward, and it drops a ton of neurochemicals. And I'm like, yes. It's interesting. You ever watch like WPT? I don't know when poker became a sport, and I don't know why it's on ESPN, but it is. So you see it all the time. You got the World Poker Tour, and you see these guys will sit at a poker table for 8, 10, 12, 14, 20 hours straight. No water, no bathroom breaks, no nothing. Because the neurochemicals that are stimulated kind of feel a little bit in your brain like, I don't know, cocaine. A lot of norepinephrine and serotonin dumps. It's kind of the same thing. So the agent of harm could be the process, but for us, mostly it's the substance, right? And it involves, how often do I use? What is the quantity? What is the protracted nature of my use? How is my tolerance to the effect of the drug increased? How is my tolerance to the LD50, which is the lethal dose curve? Now, LD50 stands for lethal dose in 50% of adult males at 150 pounds who are non-tolerant, which means that if I have 10 guys that have never done a pill in their life, and they all weigh 150 pounds, and I give them all a pill, and half of them drop dead on the spot, that's my lethal dose. The very last part of the slide said that there's a corresponding model, and it's in fact a mirror, and that is what we're going to talk about when we enter the recovery model. So, the host, heredity, genetic predisposition, all right? Okay, it covers that, which we talked about. Developmental parts, right, of the bio and psych, organic ones, predispositions, I like blood types. All kinds of things, factors come into how you process information, environmental ones. What were you exposed to? What were your peers up to? What was your teachings? What were you able to learn? What were you able not to learn? How did your brain work? Were you more right brained? Were you more left brained? How did you absorb information and data? Multiple factors, right? Psychological, what were the coping skills I developed? How did I develop them? In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when I was leaving the security of my parents and walking out to my friends, right? Did I become scared because I pushed the envelope and then run back to the security of my family, thereby getting a good moral kind of, environment, and then do it again, push out, be frightened, come back to stability, push out, be frightened, come back to stability, push even further, come back to stability. The problem is most people that become addicts start using in their teens, when this entire process of separation and reintegration is going on under Maslow. So what happens? Well, we hang out with other people that smoke weed all day or drink all day. And so when we push the envelope, our buddies don't tell us, hey, be careful. They're like, no, dude, you should totally do a bong load and skateboard off the roof into the pool. That's a great idea. So a lot of those things have stopped. They've stunted. And developmentally, a lot of the learned behaviors and skills and coping skills, those tend to be tapered because now we're starting to get them from our peers. And we're hanging out with peers that themselves do not have those particular behaviors. And most of us tend to find that we always started to hang out with the kids that were just a little bit older and a little bit cooler because we wanted to be that, hearkening back to this idea of image. One of the main problems for the alcoholic and for humans in general, which is a false equivalency, is that if I'm honest about my own experience growing up, I always compared how I felt to how you looked. The problem with that, it's a false equivalency. I'm operating a comparison based on facts, not in evidence. Because the truth is I have no idea how you feel. But still, I base my actions on how I think you feel. And that's how I dictate how I feel. It's a bad equation, right? And it even goes further. Most alcoholics base their actions on this idea of validation from others, which is this whole image thing. And they operate under this. I'm going to behave how I think you want me or approve of me to behave. So I make choices on what I think you think. To be perfectly frank, even in adulthood, even with some substantial sobriety, to be honest, I maybe know what I'm thinking, like motivationally, 60 to 70% of the time, which means that 40 to 30% of the time, I don't even know what I'm thinking. So if I'm trying to figure out what I'm thinking, you're thinking, it's like solving X times Y equals 1,012. You can't. There's no constant. It's all variables. Next. So let's talk a little bit about the environment. Excuse me. So the environment, at deeper, we're talking about these peers. We're talking about locations, even geographicals. There's a lot of social consciousness and a lot of community ideas that will influence how we see this, right? So location. Location also talks about the availability of drugs. And again, this idea of how conducive is my local area or my subculture or my community to this thing. Agent of harm. All right. Do we have a question on this one? No. Thought we did. My bad. So the AOH, and we talked about it, we'll look at it specifically broken down. The drugs, the alcohol, the substance of the process. Really, this is not a full list of the drugs, but just so you know, we find that they fall into a few categories. Stimulants, central nervous system stimulants, depressants, alcohol, benzodiazepines. They're technically minor tranquilizers, but they kind of fit in the depressive thing. That's Valium, Klonopin, Xanax, those kind of things. Alcohol, heroin fit into the depression, which means that they depress the central nervous system below the baseline, which means at detox, you swing to the same height as you were depressed above your baseline, causing what's called CNS rebound. Same thing happens with stimulants. If you're up here all the time, when you detox or achieve abstinence, you're going to crash lower, right? You're not going to have serotonin downloading, all these things. And the brain really replaces its natural production with these drugs. These drugs are external. So it kind of gets lazy and it stops producing, and it takes a while. It's a bit of an uphill battle in abstinence to regain homeostasis, the production of neurochemicals to the right level. There's dissociative drugs. A lot of the club drugs are dissociatives. One of the most common amongst teenagers right now, which is a very dangerous dissociative, is I think it's called DXM, dextromethorphan hydrobromide, right? And it's basically cough medicine that you can buy over the shelf. You know, it's interesting. There was a study talking about Mormons in Salt Lake City, teenage Mormons. They don't drink, but they're finding that a lot of them will go to Walgreens and buy cough syrup and drink that before going to a party. So there's becoming an escalation in abuse of cough syrup. Chlorocidins, I think. Chlorocidins, right? So these are the pills. They'll eat 20 of them and go to school and be out of their mind. Dissociatives, by the way, even though this one's a pharmaceutical, have an identical drug pathology to probably one of the most evil drugs in the mind of people. PCP, phencyclidine, angel dust, the horror, the terror drug, where guys break handcuffs, fight with the cops, wrestle trucks, right? It's also a dissociative hallucinogen. And ketamine, which has now become a club drug. Ketamine and PCP are actually the exact same drug in terms of their structure, right? They both operate the same way. You can always tell dissociatives. Most people, when they get high, they have what's called nystagmus, all right? Have you ever seen a cop and a stop, hold up the pen and go, now just follow this with your eyes. Okay, don't move your head. Okay, stop moving your head. All right, one more time, just with your eyes. Dude, stop moving your head. Okay, and then they do it, and what happens is they see where the eye starts to bounce at a certain angle. Like it comes out and then it starts bouncing. That's called nystagmus. Dissociatives have that nystagmus as well as this nystagmus, which is why people use those drugs to get tunnel vision, because the eye bounces so much that it ends up spinning, creating a small tunnel vision. It's a really bad drug. And what happens is that dissociatives tend to be amazing analgesics. Take ketamine, which is aryl cyclohexamine. It was originally, now they use it at veterinary places because it's a great painkiller, but it doesn't operate the same way opioids do, which means it's not a respiratory depressant, which the way people overdose from heroin is that they inherently just forget to breathe because it depresses the respiratory system so much. Aryl cyclohexamine or ketamine was originally designed and marketed to women instead of epidurals for open eye surgeries and for deliveries. The problem is most dissociatives cause you to have bad trips, even without you remembering them. And what they took it off the human use market because women were rejecting their children. They were having these crazy dissociative hallucinogens, like the evil devil baby was coming at them, and they refused them in the maternity ward, which stopped a lot of the bonding, which is, as we know, super necessary. There's process addictions, gambling, porn, video games, and we see the video gaming addiction, it tends to be really prevalent in certain type of gaming, immersive MMOs, which are like, I don't know, what's MMO stand for, Dave?
Mass multiplayer online.
Mass multiplayer online, right? They're these kind of fantasy role-playing deep immersions where the kid goes into his basement of his mom's house and plays it for like 14, 20, 25 hours straight, like eating Twinkies and pounding Mountain Dew, you know, like this becomes pathological and
About to drop a pole.
about to drop a pole. And all of these have this neuroresponse that exists in the mesolimbic system. Dave's about to drop a poll, and the poll says, which three elements of the community model mirror the medical model? It should say mirror the recovery model.
Oh.
So instead of medical model, recovery model. Sorry. So The responses are service, unity and recovery, mind, body, spirit, individual, group, and society, or gateway drug, primary drug, and drug of preference. I don't know why I'm gesticulating. You can't see me now anyway. So again, it is not, the community model doesn't mirror the medical model. We're talking about mirroring of the recovery model. And we're asking this because we're about to start talking about the recovery model. In brief, there's the second section. We will get to it in depth. And our results are in. Mind, body, spirit, 44%. Give yourself a round of applause that you got it. So some of you are familiar with the recovery model very well. So again, it's a triumvirate model. Let's move on. Oh, I got to keep clicking. Every time the poll comes off, throws me out. So the community model does have a mirror in the recovery model. Instead of the host, environment, and agent of harm, it is mind, body, and spirit. And again, I know it seems like it mirrors the medical model more, but it actually doesn't. It takes the host and understands that the host is both a part of the environment and a part of the agent of harm, and then splits the host itself into the three components of inherently what makes a person, right? So in the brain, we're talking about the limbic system, the physicality in the process, and then the upper cognitive functions, the contemplation, the prefrontal cortex, our ability to contemplate our own existence and possibly the existence of something beyond us. So we have these three factors: physical allergy, which represents the body; mental obsession, which represents the mind; and the spiritual malady, which really represents the holistic approach. Me knowing myself in my body and mind in relationship to whatever, as they say. Excuse me, an itchy ear. So here is just, we're covering again just this idea. It's the disease concept of alcoholism, right? So we start off where it says enzymes of insufficient quantity and quality, acetaldehyde, diacetic acid, to the acetone level, which stops. This creates a craving, right? What occurs is that that craving is physical and psychological, but it has a certain something, right, that we can't really put our finger on. And that is that spiritual component, the component that makes the drink almost an existential necessity for my whole self, right? So it sets off the drinking craving. The drink goes into a spree, 2 to 3 drinks, 5 drinks, 10 drinks, right? 10's into the spree, which repeats or comes out. You can either cycle through it or go through a continuum where they emerge filled with remorse and guilt. They're restless, they're irritable, discontent. The stress occurs again, which flips back to the subconscious knowledge that if I do this, the reward that comes at the end of the stress will be there no matter what, right? Then we see how the enzymes of insufficient quality create that where it does not go to the fact of the sugar, the water, and the carbon monoxide, right? We take that into the obsession where we can't quit. We think about it continuously, and now I have a necessity to drink. You know, I live to drink in the beginning. Oh, I drink because I like it. Then I live to drink. Gotta have a drink. How many times? Dude, I need a drink. I gotta have a drink. And then I drink to live at the end of that cycle. All righty. So we are at 28, where we are about to start with the specifics of the physical allergy, which we just covered briefly in that graphic. And we are, in fact, ready to start Q&A at this moment. So, Dave?
I have a good question for you. This question is from Leah. And she says, or asks, do you believe that the 12 steps are the only way to maintain recovery, emphasis on maintain, In this vein, is a spiritual connection critical for recovery, as Bill W. says in the Big Book?
Okay. Thanks for giving me a completely loaded question and putting me out on a limb. All right. So if I understood your question, it was, are the 12 steps the only way to maintain recovery? Short answer, no, they're not. However, if any of you have ever been to the racetrack, or say maybe do it periodically, do you generally bet on the long shot every single time in the hopes that the one time it comes in, you'll get rich? No. If you have any logic, you tend to approach it with the highest probability of success, right? And what we know in terms of the 12 step is that they are in fact a standalone cognitive behavioral process that include didactic and dialectic therapy and deep neurolinguistic programming, which we know to be the 3 most effective cognitive approaches in terms of behavioral change. And they wrap them up in a spiritual package. We will talk at length about spirituality when we get into the depth of the recovery model, specifically what it is and what it's not. Because what we find is that the majority of people who banty the word about quite often, a lot of times don't really know what it means. I got to tell you, I'm a man of peace, but what makes me crazy, like I don't want to say it. Sometimes I want to choke people till they have particular hemorrhages, are these guys. But you don't understand, like, I'm spiritual, not religious. Well, what does that mean? You know, like, not religious, like spiritual. Like, you know, like I bought a sage stick on Venice Beach to like clean my house out. You know, like spiritual. Okay, so there's a misconcept, and the idea is misconstrued a lot. And I'm going to leave you hanging a little bit on this one, but I will in fact say that according to the definition that I will posit down the line, in probably the next few slides, a spiritual connection is absolutely necessary. What that actually means, we'll see as we go along. But it is not the only process to maintain sobriety. However, because of its efficacy, its availability, and its continuum, we are increasingly involved in a process. I don't go to AA to like take my medicine and go home. I go because the more sober I get, the more my problems become sophisticated and filled with minutia and subtlety. And in order for me to address those or even be receptive for solution, I have to increase my capacity to develop spiritually so that I can receive that information from other sources and be sophisticated enough to process it and then apply it. A continuum of recovery, a continuum of self-help in the 12-step paradigm is what we know to be the most effective, just in numbers. I'm not saying that the same can occur from deep work in a church or a group or service. You have to understand that the fellowship of AA is 3 legacies. It's also a triumvirate. It's recovery, which are the 12 steps, which create what is called internal personal spiritual development. It is the traditions, which are suggestions about how groups should operate. And what are groups? A bunch of people. So those guidelines help me to develop interpersonal spiritual relationships. A lot of people say that the steps are to prevent suicide and the traditions are to prevent homicides. And finally, there's 12 concepts of world service. And these are meant to develop what's called transpersonal spiritual development or true charitable spiritual development. At the end of the book, in Alcoholics Anonymous on page 164, it says, you cannot transmit something you haven't got. And what we generally lack that prevents us from transmitting is the ability to receive with grace, which is a developed technique that we had to learn because all we were used to was taking. Hope that answers. And I hope it was vague enough so I didn't wreck my presentation next week.
Yeah, no, so I think what we should do is we should answer one more live.
Okay.
And just make sure everybody knows that you guys can type your questions in, and even if we don't get to them, we still will follow up.
Right. Oh,
right? So
I
we want to
did-
make sure we can have you guys ask as many questions as you want, get them down, send them to us. Even if we don't get to them now, we'll save them and respond. So please, the more questions you ask, the better. And we're
What-
getting a ton.
what Dave said. Now, I did send emails to every question I got. I did get a couple bounce backs. I got a little dyslexia. I'm working it out so I can go right to the if you didn't get yours and you asked the question, my bad. I'm sorry. I'll make it right. I promise.
So let's get one more. Ursula asked a good question.
Ursula. It's a great name. What do you got?
It's in theory 2 questions, but we'll let this slide, Ursula. It's okay. We'll get it's a kind of a twofer. They're related. So the question is addiction incurable and only manageable? Short answer is okay.
And only manageable. All right. So let me say that I am not a doctor, even though you asked me a medical question, at least not an MD. But I will say this. With what we know at this moment, the most current information from all the fields, neurology, neuropsychology, addictionology, everything, across the board, industry standard, at the cutting edge, from what we know now, addiction at this point is inherently incurable. It is a continuum of disease, which is what necessitates a continuum of recovery. And at this point, being cured means not having those things. Much like diabetes, which is incurable, and there's a lot of similarities between diabetes. I mean, I know a lot of diabetics, they'll run into the closet and eat a couple ho-hos periodically. I get it. I mean, I'm not mad at them, but you know, it's similarities. It is inherently continuously manageable, eminently treatable, eminently manageable. And this is something that I personally hear a lot, and it bothers me. I've been in this field for a while. I've heard a ton of professionals in the field, as well as family members, addicts themselves, say this: relapse is part of recovery. Not true. Relapse is part of addiction. Recovery in a continuum is not. All right, that's it for tonight. Thank you all for coming. You've been awesome. Even though I have no idea who you are, I really wish I could hear your voices, because that would be good. Because like I said, if you laughed at my jokes once in a while, it would just make my day. So you guys have a great week. Send in your questions. Do your homework if you didn't do it last week. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you.